All right, part two of talking about Entra identities and the different types. In part one, we talked about users, both company users, B2B users, and B2C users. We talked about devices and what it means if a device is registered versus Entra joined versus hybrid joined. And we covered a little bit about AD Connect and syncing users, and we talked about the Entra P1 and P2 licenses and what you get from just a regular free license. So this part we are specifically going to be talking about enterprise applications and what they're used for and how they work as an identity that's separate from users and computers or users and devices. I'm going to apologize ahead of time if there's some wonky editing on this video. I am going to try to use a third-party video editor to kind of white out some sensitive information because I'm demonstrating with my own tenant, and there's some stuff that I just don't want to be out on the internet. So if you get weird white boxes, that's me, and I apologize, but that's what we're going to do. So the first thing I want to talk about is about what applications in Entra are used for. Now, this is going to be a really broad category, and some of it's going to be kind of confusing. So if you don't quite understand, that's fine. The gist of it that I want you to know is that essentially an application represents something that needs permission in your tenant, either to 365 user and group data, or like data about who's signing into 365 or your tenant, or it might need information on or permissions to resources in your Azure tenant. And that depends on what the application is and how it's being used and whether it's managed by you or managed by another company. Essentially, any application, whether owned by you or not, is going to be needs to be represented in Entra for your users to sign into it or for to grant it permissions in your tenant. Now, commonly, there's a few reasons you might be making your own applications, and that is also going to be for granting permissions. Like if you have a web application that needs to be able to grant people permissions based on groups, and you're not using OIDC or groups roles based assignments, which we're not really going to talk about, it might need the ability to read groups and group memberships from your Entra tenant. In that case, you'd create the application in your tenant, and then you go into API permissions, and you go to graph and say grant groups manage all. We'll talk about that in a little bit as we get into some of the permissions, but there are going to be cases where you're creating your own applications. There's also going to be cases where you are going to be adding applications that other people have created. Now, there's one thing that I wanted to clarify before we really get into any more details, and that is going to be every application has two different representations in your tenant. You have what's called the app registration, and you have what's called an enterprise application. I have two tabs up here for those different screens. This is my enterprise application screen, and this is going to be my app registration screen. Now, those two, the explaining the differences, I'm still kind of gray on exactly what the difference is, but in my mind, the way that I separate these two is your app registration is going to define what that app is, and that's going to be your branding, links to the app's homepage, links to about the app. It will also include, that's kind of the customer facing elements of it. It will also include a list of what permissions the app requires in your tenant. That's going to be your API permissions, and some back end information like does this app map to some sort of roles for permissions in your tenant, or how do you sign into the app? That's all configured in the app registration. Now, if you own the application, like these are two applications that I own and I created, you set that information. You've got your branding screen, you set the icon, the name, you can specify some of this backend metadata. You can also go and define what permissions in your Entra tenant does this app need. Now, that's a little bit different from applications that might be owned by another company that are then being published. You're not necessarily going to control the branding. You don't know what permissions those apps might need, or at least you're not going to define those. The company's going to define those. So that another company might create the app registration in their tenant, in which case all you have to do is add the app to your tenant and all that's predefined. In order to do that, uh, the objects that are actually defined in your tenant aren't app registrations. Those are going to be enterprise applications. In my mind, like I said, there's still some gray area here as to exactly where these lines cross. But the way I separate these are app registration is creating that information about the app and what it needs. An enterprise application is actually defining the identity of that application in your tenant, meaning this is objects that are actually represented in your tenant that you can then use to assign those permissions or grant the API permissions that are specified. Um, as a way to demonstrate that, if I go back to app registrations, this is my Terraform deployments app, right? This is one that I created, I defined the information. If I go to enterprise applications, it's also listed here because this is the identity of that app that I can then use to assign roles in Azure elsewhere or in 365. However, if I wanted to add an app that I'm not defining it, that's supplied by some other company, I'm not going to create an app registration for that because I don't define this information. Instead, I will go to enterprise applications and I can go to new application here and I get a list of applications that are available in the gallery that I can then add to my tenant. For example, if I search for LinkedIn, I can click here and I can click the create button, and that takes this app that somebody else created, it's their representation of the app, and it adds it to my enterprise application. And now I can use that because it has an identity. I can assign users access to this app if I wanted to do single sign-on of some sort. Notice this app comes with a number of different single sign-on methods that are available. I can't define some of these other properties like the branding because that's not something I control. That app registration was created by someone else. But this app now has an identity in my tenant that I can use to assign permissions elsewhere. Now, if I go back to app registration and all applications and I refresh, LinkedIn shows here and I can see, does this app have any API permissions that it is defined by its creators that it needs in our tenant? And it looks like no, it doesn't. At least not yet. It might be different if a user signs in and then asks for those permissions, in which case it'll pop up here and I can grant them, but that's doesn't really matter. In this case, the app registration, all it matters here is I shouldn't be able to edit this information. It looks like I can. Either way, doesn't matter. Enterprise application is your identity, and app registration is going to be information about that app. As an example to clarify this point, something that I came across myself, I use Terraform to deploy almost all the resources in my tenant. If I use Terraform and create an app registration, what I will get that app registration that exists in the portal. But what that doesn't create is the enterprise application. It only creates the registration. If I then try and go assign a role to that app in Azure to some resource, that app will not show up as being able to assign because it doesn't have an enterprise application. It only has an app registration. So I have to go back to my Terraform configuration and make sure I'm creating both the app registration and the enterprise application. And once I have both of those, then I can assign the role to the enterprise application. Conversely, if you're creating apps in the portal, you never have to worry about that because if you create an app registration, it will automatically create an enterprise application as well. So, because of that, you don't really ever get that disparity where you create the app registration but you don't have an identity that you can use elsewhere or reference elsewhere in your tenant. So that's something I've came across that kind of helped cement that idea in my head a little bit. I've talked a little bit about the graph and the API permissions. Figured I'd spend some time defining what exactly that means. If I go back to app registration and I go into Terraform deployments, this is the app that I own, and I go into API permissions, these are all API permissions that I've added. Now, I use this application to grant rights to Terraform to create or manage resources for me. So if I just look at these rights, I can see the sort of resources that I've created with Terraform. These are the permissions it has right now. And it has group read write all, meaning it can create and manage groups. And then I have administrative units read all, meaning If I wanted to delegate, an administrative unit is essentially like an OU in Entra. The difference is it's not file based, it's just a group or a container that can be used to segregate a certain number of objects. So I think I used administrative units to say Terraform only has rights to manage these specific groups that are in this administrative unit. Obviously, Terraform needed to be able to read the administrative unit to know it had rights to it. So those are permissions I have. If I wanted to grant Terraform the ability to create users, you'll notice right here it only has user read listed as a permission. I can go in here to my app registration, I can click add a permission, and then you have a list of all these different API endpoints that are available that you can configure permissions for. These are all affiliated some way with your tenant. Microsoft Graph is the main one because that's kind of the primary interface that Microsoft provides for you to interact with Entra ID and permissions to 365. So if I click in here, I'm not going to get into the difference between delegated and application. We'll just deal with application because we know this is operating on its own. It's not operating in behalf of a user. And let's go to user. You'll notice there's a whole bunch of different permissions you can assign. Each one of these come with their own category or permissions. And if I expand user, I can check any one of these fields. It already has user read, but if I go to user read write all, this allows the app to read and update user profiles without a signed in user, meaning this can now create users on my behalf, and I can add that permission if I want. I'm not going to do that right now because I don't actually need Terraform to do that, but that's an example of how you can configure Graph API permissions to an application so that it can manipulate your tenant without necessarily needing a user to do it for you. The other thing that I was going to mention is single sign-on and how that works. If I go to authentication, I don't think it's authentication. Where is this? Let's try going to the enterprise applications here. Yeah, so this is an OIDC application, so this isn't a great example. But actually, let's go back to LinkedIn because that was one that has it. If I go to LinkedIn and I go to single sign-on, you'll see listed here, I have the option of configuring SAML for single sign-on. Me and SAML, we'll talk about that more in the single sign-on section and how it works. But essentially, SAML, what that does is, if I set this up and I make this application that's in our catalog available to users, when they open it from the catalog and they go to type in their work email, which is what they use to sign in, as soon as it sees the email, what's going to happen is rather than signing them in with that account at LinkedIn, it's going to redirect them to an Entra ID login page, the same one that they would see if they were logging into Entra. They log into their credentials there, and then it redirects them back to LinkedIn signed in. That's the single sign-on method, and these are what you can configure. There's SAML is a really common one. Also, OIDC is probably growing in prevalence really quickly because it's a little bit simpler. We're going to talk about that in the next video, which is going to be talking about single sign-on authentication because that's a big portion of Entra ID. But essentially, applications can be configured to support those sign-in methods if they've got an entry in your tenant. So if you're creating applications, it doesn't have to be owned by you, that you can come in here and configure authentication methods for it as well. That's it for the application content. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next section because we're going to go into a little bit of some more of the web-based sign-in or authentication methods that are also affiliated with these application records. But essentially, applications are identities that aren't tied to a user or a device, but can be used to configure everything around an application, either the sign-in for it or the permission. And oftentimes an application or service principal isn't just something you log into, but might also be some sort of automation account. Similar to like a service account in Active Directory, it's an account that can act on its own without necessarily needing a user behind it. So if you're automating something, you can use an application, aka a service principal, and grant permissions to that to run the automation rather than needing to store one of your individual user accounts in order to run that on their behalf. That's applications. And that wraps up the Entra Identities videos. Our next one, as I've mentioned, is going to be talking about single sign-on and some more of the web-based authentication methods. We're going to get into some of the password complexity and passwordless sign-on for users and how Microsoft has done that. And then we're going to talk about some of the web-based single sign-on authentication methods, being SAML, OIDC, and some OAuth configurations and how that works. That's coming up in the next video. Thanks.